Welcome back to Critic Proof. I'm Alyssa Rosenberg, the culture critic at Think Progress and a columnist at Slate and The Atlantic. And I'm here today with
Michael Moynihan, who is the cultural news editor at Newsweek Daily Beast.
Excellent. So we are here today because you have accused me of the cardinal sin of being a politically correct square. At least that's what I understand that we're doing here.
Yes, yeah, it wasn't that bad. I mean, you were the least problematic of the bunch. But as I mentioned in the piece, those were things that I happened to read over the course of the past 24 hours. So first of all, you should be flattered that I was reading your stuff, and.
I should be flattered that you're reading my stuff. Okay.
Yes. No, I was happily reading your stuff, and so the piece. And one thing I actually have to say to start with. I mean, I noticed this when I was responding on Twitter, and there was quite a bit of response, a lot of it positive, some criticism, of course, which you expect. Is that a lot of people were responding to the headline and the subhead. Neither of which I wrote, and I just want to say right away that I am not responsible for, and I am perfectly happy and fine with people making political points about sort of cultural products, whether they be films, television series, art, the rest of it. My objection was the over-politicization of certain films and television shows where I don't think the criticism is warranted. And the idea for the column came, a little late, of course, because this has been a kind of roiling debate since last year, but about Lena Dunham and Girls, which I finally decided that no, I wasn't too old and too male and to watch it, and I did, and I actually rather surprisingly enjoyed it. And decided to pick up there. So that's kind of the background of the piece. And
Sure.
And I didn't say that Alyssa Rosenberg was a PC apparatchik. So I deny that. I deny it now. I will do so.
I feel like if I was, an apparatchik, I'd be better paid.
Yeah, probably.
So first, the idea that Girls is not for men is very strange to me. And like you and Kurt Sutter, who are the creator of Sons of Anarchy, seem to be part of this wave of guys who sort of resisted the show and was like, it's for girls, as if stuff like Sons or any, like The Sopranos or any other archetypes of guy culture, those are assumed to be for everybody, right? Like,
yeah.
But if it's girly, it's for ladies. It's like something that we can only go to the bathroom in groups and watch together. And I find that very strange. Like the idea that the male viewpoint is neutral and for everybody, but like, lest we examine femininity, oh my God, like you might have an inadvertent gender change. It's very odd to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the original reaction from a lot of people is the fact that it's called Girls, which is, saying that this is the demographic we're shooting for. It's girls. It's, modern young women in New York. My resistance was not so much the gender thing. I was sort of more joking about that than it was that I lived in Williamsburg 10 years ago. And sort of, I think I moved there in 2000, 2001. And it just felt like, that this is maybe not something I'm going to connect with. I was actually rather surprised that not much had changed since I was there, of the, people leading these sort of generally complicated, needlessly complicated sort of hipster lifestyles and doing cocaine and trying to pay their rent and everything. So there is a kind of universality to it that my initial instinct was like, yeah, maybe this is probably not marketing a show to me, and it might be sort of one generation off for me. I'm 37, I think, or 38. I can't remember. I'm old, but no, I was really surprised when I watched the show that there was nothing particularly sort of gender specific about it. I didn't find that at all.
I also think the male characters on Girls are actually really good a lot of the time. I have a critic friend and. Where he and I jokingly, until they slept together, referred to each other as Ray and Shoshana. Because, Ray is this very, I think, specific, wonderful character of this guy who presents as a know-it-all, but is actually sort of incredibly vulnerable and not together. And I don't know how much of this season you've seen, but he's a character who gets just unbelievable humanity, and it's warm and really wonderful. And so, I think something like 85% of girls' problems stem from its title, right? Like, guys think it's not for them. Women who don't see themselves represented in the show say, well, it's called Girls, but it's, for white middle-class girls.
Am I wrong in this? I mean, you know far more about this than I do. I'm just less of a critic than I am a viewer that pretends to be a critic once in a while. Is that, the episodes that I've seen, I think the first two, am I wrong in thinking they were written by a woman who's sort of in her mid-40s, right? I mean, it's not,
Jenny
just...
Connor?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, it's not just Lena Dunham, and I mean, it's also Judd Apatow is involved.
Yeah.
So it is a huge misperception in a lot of ways that it's written by sort of rich girls that went to St. Anne's in Brooklyn Heights and all have rich parents, and only reflects that. I think that was a weird misconception that I had too. That it's sort of written by a number of different people who don't fit that sort of I live in Greenpoint and I'm young demographic.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I kind of believe in narrowcasting, right? I think that you often get, and this is something that coming to your story, the more specific you get, I often think the more interesting the stories are. And so for me, the problem with Girls was never that it was a product of, either Lena Dunham's upbringing or that it reflected this very narrow sort of, white inner circle of close friends. Because I think those groups of people exist. I feel fortunate that my group of friends doesn't look exactly like that, but there have been times in my life when it did. And my problem was never that it represented that very narrow perspective, but that there weren't more narrow perspectives represented, right? I mean, it's always interesting to me that people say a black woman would never get this shot, which is untrue. Shonda Rhimes just signed Issa Rae, who is, creates web television series, most notably The Misadventures of Awkward Black Girl. ABC just bought a show from her. So it's a situation where a network is giving a woman of color actually a bigger stage and more money to do, what she wants to do.
Yeah.
She won't have the same creative freedom that Dunham has, but that's one of the things that you trade away when you get to that larger audience.
I also think that's interesting too, is that I didn't, because I was writing about something very, very specific and a few pieces that I had seen that had interested me. I kind of put it somewhere in, the first couple of graphs that, shows and films that have been criticized on political grounds that I thought were sort of unfair. One of those that I mentioned was The Muppets, and that was a right-wing thing. It was some sort of lunkhead on Fox News who said this is an anti-capitalist sort of, furry Menshevik kind of film. Absolutely absurd. And it really didn't fit in. I mean, there's plenty of that I can do. The Brent Bozels of the world that are always sniffing out little sort of heterodoxies in film. But I think it's funny, what you just mentioned is that conservatives have the idea that Hollywood is sort of deeply and kind of incorrigibly liberal, and you can't sort of change this. We have to start our own kind of rival industry, and this is this kind of Glenn Beck way of doing things. And then again, you see the criticisms that I was talking about of liberals saying that, Hollywood has a race problem, or Hollywood treats sort of women in certain television shows as kind of second-class citizens, or gives them bad roles, or doesn't treat older women or give them any roles with any respect. So I find it really interesting of these two narratives that I always come up against. I think both of which are totally wrong. That exist side by side without anyone really, pointing this out.
I think the answer is that to a certain extent, Hollywood represents the mythical third party. Like, Hollywood to a certain extent is moderate Republicans, right? It's very liberal on social issues. It's also full of rich people who, have varying relationships to how they want to pay their taxes. It has, to a certain extent, extremely conservative gender politics. It is, the originator of many societal reinforcements of conventional gender politics. It's a town that is heavily, heavily unionized. But at the same time, it's the people in its dominant industry were really frightened away from the prospect of radicalism by things like the HUAC hearing. So the idea that Hollywood is liberal is quite a shallow idea. It's not exceptional, and it fails to account for, I think, if you plotted, and it's also important to separate out Hollywood's hiring practices and the conduct of its dominant industry as a business from the values that are espoused in its popular culture, right? I mean, this is an industry where, very few women write, direct, produce, have any sort of creative control, where they're often stuck in lower end jobs. If Hollywood were not, a town that has all at will employment, you would probably see a class action against the studios and networks, right? I mean, the employment numbers are grotesque. The pay gaps are huge. The entertainment industry is a profoundly unjust industry in a lot of ways that, also has this very sort of scatterplot, set of political beliefs that come out on screen in various ways, and that, some of which are structurally determined. Hollywood loves the military because the military loves giving Hollywood equipment, right? I mean, there are these, for all that Wayne LaPierre complains about violent entertainment, gun manufacturers, who are his primary constituents, make an enormous amount of money off of licensing guns to films or images of guns to films. And some of them, the social issues are sort of all, in the air as opposed to sort of structural forces. It helps that you have a lot of gay people in the industry and prominent gay people in the industry. You don't mess with David Geffen.
I think it's an interesting point because Hollywood is liberal in the sense that you're not going to find a huge amount of money going to the Romney campaign from sort of major players in Hollywood. Sure. But as you say, I don't know a lot of the sort of numbers that you do about employment, but I take your word for it. And this is your area. So that said, I think there's a sort of tie-in to what I was writing about, was that there is this kind of binary view of things, and that, I got a little it was unnerving to see when I was on Google the autocomplete of Lena Dunham racist, which was, I thought was really troubling. And it's like, racism, this charge of that she is racist, or, the one that I if I'd only waited a day, by the way, to write this piece, I would have, the thing that I suppose we'll get to of your blog post would have clearly been replaced by something that was actually egregious. I saw something on Slate the other day where you write, absolutely absurd thing, in the commenters pointed this out, that Archer was homophobic. This kind of idea that there's homophobia, and then there's shows that are sort of pro-gay or believe in equality, or that there's.
Are you saying that I wrote? Are you saying that I wrote that post about Archer because I?
No. What I'm saying is that had I waited a day, that came out a day after my piece, I would have replaced your sort of rather not very offensive quote that I put in, and replaced it with something like that, which was more of what I was getting at, which was this kind of knee-jerk reaction to accusing things of being sort of sexist or racist or something. But back to my point is that I think that the same thing is true of people making these types of accusations. As Hollywood is liberal, when you look at sort of the amount of money that is given to political candidates, as you point out, it's far more complicated than that. And that is also the case with something like girls. But if you do a Google search, you're going to see, hundreds and hundreds of posts, is Lena Dunham a racist? Lena Dunham's race problem. That kind of stuff, which strips away all the nuance, and you can have a very interesting and I think productive discussion about why the show features the characters that it features, and why, actually a more interesting discussion is, where I lived in Williamsburg, I used to work at Vice, that sort of magazine, their constituents all around there in Greenpoint and Williamsburg. It is a very, very white culture. So much so, in fact, that, the New York Times actually did a piece on black hipsters, blipsters, as they called them. It was such a rare thing. And there was a great quote in it from this guy who's, some sort of post-punky band and stuff. He would go to shows and people would think that he was the security guard. It was that rare. So, I mean, that's an interesting conversation of these people sort of matriculating from high-end, expensive universities and all congregating together in these areas. That's more interesting to me than saying Lena Dunham is a racist or that she has a race problem, which I don't think is I don't think it's, number one, I don't think it's true, and number two, I don't think it's constructive.
Let me back this up for you a little bit.
Sure.
Because I think that there are a couple of ways to talk about politics in pop culture. And one of them is to sort of check ideological boxes. It's the kind of work that a site like Big Hollywood does a lot of the time.
Yes.
And to sort of do like political correctness card checks. Mm-hmm. I find that incredibly boring. Mm-hmm. But where I do think that talking about the politics of culture is interesting and really important is sort of where it intersects with the quality of writing. And I think the actual race problem that Girls had in its first season was that when characters of color came on screen, the writing became much broader and less specific. I think that the nanny scene in the first season where Jessa sort of tries to rally a bunch of, women of color who work in the nannying industry as their career as opposed to in a sort of dilettantish fashion was really shallow. I don't think it worked particularly well. As an explication of Jessa's sort of myopia, it was somewhat interesting, but I thought that it didn't have nearly the precision of, a lot of the other interactions, right? Like Michael Imperioli's character, who's Hannah's writing teacher, Hannah's boss even, again, this, sort of touchy guy who she works in an office with, and Hannah's, that first office job of Hannah's, her interactions with her white employer in that setting are much more precise and weird and interesting than her interactions with the women of color who work with her in the office. And I think that, if a character, if a creator wants to write about race and a white character's interactions with people of color, it would be nice if that is done as well as everything else in the show. I mean, one of the things that makes 30 Rock...
What did you object to the interactions between Lena Dunham's character and the other women who worked at the office? What was your objection to how that was written?
I just thought it was sort of flat, right? There's no... I mean, you learn that they're sort of putting up with it because they need the jobs. But... it's sort of a couple of sentences. They're just, there's no real interest in spending time with them, right? Like, they're just sort of there. They're not, the boss turns out to be this sort of benevolent, but, sort of handsy guy. He's touchy, but he's not hitting on Hannah. Hannah's,
he's benevolent and malevolent at the same time.
Right. I mean, it's surprising, right? I mean, there is a sort of specific turn to the humanity there. And 30 Rock, for example, spent a ton of time doing that with its characters of color. And from the very first episode, Tracy asks Pete, the producer on the show, it's like, Pete, you smoke weed? Pete doesn't know whether he's supposed to say yes and look cool and ingratiate himself with the new star or be honest and say no, so he says no. And Tracy says, oh, good, me neither. And it's immediately like, it plays both on our reaction, it plays on our assumptions about Tracy, who we've been introduced to as this, like, insane character, and Pete's reaction to him, as someone he has to work with. And I mean, 30 Rock is an insanely dense show, right? I mean, there was one 2010 episode where there were like 9 jokes per minute. I mean, the density is literally that heavy. And, I thought in the first season, the writing around random people of color that Hannah encountered was not as sort of specific or weird as her writing around random white characters who passed through the movie, and that's who passed through the show. And
you don't suspect that was deliberate at all.
I mean, as a critic watching it from the outside, like, I just didn't think it was as good. I didn't get as much out of those interactions. There was not sort of a specificity to them. And I think we can go down. I don't really care about authorial intent that much. I don't think it's a useful. I think it's both a fallacy and sort of not a particularly useful tool for judging what the actual result is that we see on screen. Like, I don't give points to someone for trying and failing, right? Like, that's not how this game works. But, you know, and again, part of the problem is that we had a very small sample size there, right? I mean, it's, you know, 2 scenes with characters of color versus many scenes with random other white people. But it's just, I thought qualitatively it was not as good. And the example that you pulled out from a piece that I wrote about Deception, so Deception is a show, and I think it's important to consider the sort of production history of the show because it explains a little bit more of what I'm about to say. Deception is a show that is about a woman who was the daughter of a housekeeper for a wealthy family. She became very sort of attached to the children in the family. She grows up, moves away, becomes a cop. The daughter of this wealthy family, who was her childhood best friend, becomes troubled and is eventually murdered. And she is sent back into the family, sort of undercover to try and figure out what happened. And the show was initially written race neutral. And when the family itself began to cast as white, Jennifer Salk, who runs drama development at NBC, told the creators that she wanted to cast a woman of color as the lead. The actress who was eventually cast was Megan Good. The runner-up was, I believe, Latina. So the show's creators hadn't planned to... They didn't know what they were going to do going in with that dynamic. And, you know, there are specific connotations to being a woman of color and doing domestic work in America. There's a history that attaches to that. It's something that, you know, inflects an already extant power relationship between, you know, employer and employee, between particularly when the employer is employing live-in help. And so I thought there was a lot of sort of detail that could be mined from the fact that it, you know, Megan Good's character is not just the daughter of the help, but the African-American daughter of the help in a white family. That
what is wrong with making, or the decision that they made in the sense that making, and I might be overstating it by using the word incidental, but making race not a sort of predominant plot factor or sort of incidental to the story, in the sense that
race isn't inconsequential in that setting. Like, there is no way in the world, no matter like how good the intentions are of anyone, like in the real world, being an African American domestic in a white family. Let me finish, okay? Because there's no way that interaction is not touched by race in some way. And so if you want to pretend that, like, everyone's super colorblind, that's nice, but you're giving up story detail. And I think that's boring. I think you are giving up a chance to shade in the character. I mean, you have a setup here that never happens in popular culture, right? Where, like, you know, an African-American cop, Laz Alonso, who plays her boss and ex-boyfriend, are investigating this, like, white, decadent, rich family. This is just not something that you see ever. And to pretend that, like, race has nothing to do with it is just giving up an entire tranche of, like, details that you could work into interactions, of sort of moral judgment, of, you know, of plotting. And why would you give that up? It is inexplicable to me that you would give up any chance to make your characters more specific. I do not understand it. I think it's bad writing.
So, a couple things. I mean, in some sense, you're objecting to the writing, or the way. How many episodes have been? I mean, this just started, the show. I mean, I don't know if you've seen multiple episodes of it, or screeners. But
this is also based on reporting. Like, we talked to the showrunners about this.
Yeah, sure. So, but, is it? I mean, first of all, we don't entirely know that this won't be a plot point at one time in the show.
Right,
but
Michael, I have to judge what I've seen, right? I mean, you know, this is the thing about television, is that you write stuff and then you watch more of it and you go back.
Sure, but the objection is that it doesn't reflect the sort of racial politics that you want it to reflect in the episodes that you've seen, which, you know, is fair enough. Projecting
this onto me is like, you know, something that I think their characters are less interesting because they've made and specific because they've made a decision to forego a certain kind of tension, and they don't have it. I mean, I can't stress to you enough watching someone sit on a stage silent for a full minute because they're so surprised to be asked about something that is profoundly obvious, right? Like, I think these characters are less interesting and more flat for a refusal to think about something that exists, like, in the world. You know? I don't understand why it's so objectionable to want more detail in the characters, or, you know, I mean...
Well, I don't think it's objectionable at all. I mean, that type of criticism to me is objecting to the writer not applying the sort of politics that you wish that they would apply, which again, as I said, it's perfectly within your right to say that. I don't think it's terribly...
I think you're misinterpreting me, though. I mean, this is not like again, it's not a PC wish list. It's straight up a... I don't care if the viewpoint on race is conservative. I just want it to be specific. Like, I mean, I don't care if, you know, I would be very interested to see more conservative television, for example, or, you know, conservative pop culture in general. I don't care that the end result is that, like, Tate Donovan's character casts off his racism and, like, embraces Vivian and, you know, everything is great. Like, I'm not talking about outcomes. I'm not talking about, like, the ultimate message. I'm talking about specificity of interaction and character development. Like, I don't care that this is, like, I don't want this show to be, like, a screed about the, you know, terrible troubles, like, African-American domestics go through. I want the people to understand that these interactions would be colored by historical weight and that makes their characters more interesting.
Look, I mean, obviously the writer's prerogative there, and I think that you know, in some time in the show, I mean, I don't think it can be entirely incidental, and obviously the writer, whoever the woman you mentioned, has wanted the lead to be an African-American woman, so is conscious.
This isn't a writer. This is a network executive.
Network executive, okay, that is conscious of that in some sense. But you know, I didn't talk about these things in isolation. There's a bunch of things that I had read over the course of a couple of days, and I think another example that was David Hagelund, who criticized a Portlandia sketch on Nerds, which I thought was unbelievably funny and touching, that it sort of missed the gender politics of nerdery, which I have to admit, and I did mention in my piece that I was unfamiliar with, that there were people that denied that there were female nerds or something. But I think there's a point when, you know, applying sort of, I don't want to say PC, because I don't think that's right. I don't think that you're being PC. I think that, as you said, that, you know, you think that there are kind of untapped stories here. I just see that there's a very, very specific and very constant, and I think it's often with younger critics and people, I think, sort of more recently out of college and stuff, who are more inclined to see things in a kind of race, class, gender paradigm. And again, let's be abundantly clear that I'm not criticizing that. I think it's very useful in some senses, and often very useful. But, you know, I think that there's two other things that I saw. You know, there's a Volkswagen ad that was accused by Charles Blow of being racist because there's a guy in it imitating a Jamaican accent. I think when you take all of these things together, there is an attempt to over-politicize things and to apply politics where none might be needed. And I think that there are times that you can have a show with an African-American lead who has a complicated background, who said, you know, the cleaner and this kind of, which is all fraught with potentially interesting plot lines that, again, might develop later. But I don't see that that's I wouldn't be upset about that. I'd sort of wait to see where it went. And even if it didn't go there, I don't see that it's like necessarily a missed opportunity. There's a lot of shows that do that.
I mean, I'm always entertained when, like, you know, someone tells me that, or when someone sort of swoops in and is like, you care too much about X or you care too much about Y, right? Like, you know, I think that you have.
But let me just say, just to I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to say, I don't think that you care too much or too little or whatever. I just think in this instance it was misplaced. And I don't think that it's, this was actually, let me just say this too, it was another criticism that I think was an appropriate one, because my own fault that I didn't, I think, express it clearly enough. And you have, paring things down to 800 words and writing them in 3 hours, you tend to miss a lot of nuance. But the idea, which was also conveyed in this stupid subhead, that things shouldn't be, popular culture shouldn't be spoken of or addressed in a political way, and the politics of it should be ignored. I think that that's obviously totally wrong. So I just to make sure that you understand that that's not my position.
Sure. I mean, I just think it's worth, you and I don't know each other, but you are in a position where popular culture privileges your perspectives. It offers you up a lot of people who look like you. It, there's there are jokes about middle-aged guys, but the idea that there's not a lot of popular culture.
Hey, I'm not middle-aged. I'm old, not middle-aged.
But, popular culture wants to court you. It is not going to operate at your expense. It puts people like you on screen all the time and makes them heroes and aspirational figures and awesome. And, I have some questions about, I kind of want to interrogate the idea that people who don't see themselves represented
this is
being
interesting.
oversensitive.
Yeah, no, this is interesting. I think this is a different, because I know you're going in that direction, I'll just ask you a quick question, is that this is slightly different than what you were saying before. This is a question that I have, and not trying to set a trap or anything, actually an honest question, is that I am most sympathetic to the argument that somebody is missing an important plot point, or could develop a script in a better way if they included something like race, which would sort of either build tension. I mean, something like, for instance, race in The Wire, which is obviously unavoidable, but made that show so fascinating and so sort of layered. And I think that's why so many people appreciated it, and David Simon's absolutely brilliant job with that. This is something different. And so I often wonder about this. If, we need representation, or, Elspeth Reeve, who said in the Atlantic Wire that, Lena Dunham should expand her circle of friends, which her very personal criticism of Lena Dunham's social situation.
Sure.
But the one that I don't know is that what do we expect to happen if there is representations of African Americans, for instance, in Girls or in another television show? I mean, why is that socially a good thing rather than just story writing?
I mean, I don't think that there's a choice between them, right? I mean, I think that, there are studies that show that Caucasian boys are the only sort of group of children who experience boosts in their self-esteem after consuming television. It's a small study, it's a limited sample size, it's short-term effects, not long-term effects. So there's a lot of work to be done here, right? But seeing yourself validated on screen, whether that's something that's studied sociologically or, just as an aesthetic experience, is exciting, right? I mean, I'm sure you can remember the first time that you saw something that really spoke to you, not just in a, oh, it's cool to see someone like me doing X, but, oh my God, this reflects my experience in an incredibly profound way, right? I mean, there has to be something like that for you, right?
I wish. I'm actually honestly trying to think, and I don't know. I don't see much. I mean, if you take it in a very sort of base level of sort of race and background and stuff, of course, I have a name like Moynihan. No, but I'm also saying experience for me is, I'm sort of politically homeless. Culturally, my interests don't sort of overlap with a lot of stuff on American television, which is why BitTorrent and sort of Channel 4 in the UK have been helpful to me. but no, I absolutely understand what you're saying. I just don't know. I think sometimes we overplay the importance of things like this.
Sorry?
I said I think sometimes we overplay the importance of what effect, besides sort of assuaging the sort of guilty conscience of Lena Dunham. Lena Dunham.
Listen to me for a second. Why shouldn't the pleasure of being able to see yourself on the screen, why isn't that a valuable goal? To me, it's like, that sort of moment of sort of recognition or understanding or someone nailing an experience that I've had that I thought was mine alone is, I mean, that is a very particular kind of joy. You know, as a critic, I want everyone to have access to that, right? I mean, to me, that is just sort of a wonderful, lovely goal. And I don't see that as
people do have access to that now.
I mean, I think some people have more, and I think some people have more access to it than others.
But what about, I mean, we had a year-long debate about people having that access on girls. I mean, does it have to be in every television show? And do you think that Lena Dunham's defense of this, I mean, not really defense, but her explanation of it, of saying that this reflects my social circle. I mean, she did grow up in sort of privileged circumstances and went to Oberlin, and these are the people that she hangs out with, and many of them are actually her friends.
I mean, I've said this already, that I don't think Lena Dunham, I mean, I think there are two ways to give people that sort of experience, right? One way is to sort of integrate ensemble shows, which I think is something that's actually happened fairly effectively overall. I mean, NBC's made, did extremely diverse casting for its fall set of shows this year. Go On has something like 6 characters of color in its ensemble. I mean, obviously you have something like Deception, something like Happy Endings, which has one of the only interracial couples on television. So that's one way to do things that I think is interesting, but not actually particularly sufficient. And I think some of the things that I was talking about earlier, where, getting more people the opportunity to narrowcast is the thing that I'm most interested in. That, have you ever watched something like Living Single? I love Living Single. It's like Queen Latifah, magazine editor in the city. It was part of Fox's efforts to build itself into one of the big networks, in part by relying heavily on an African-American audience. And so, I'm the cheesy person in the world who wants Living Single back, because it's, again, this, it's an all-black show, which in its way is much more interesting to me than, like, New Girl once every 2 years doing an episode that's like, oh, Lamorne Morris is on the show, and, like, we have to think about race, and Schmidt's going to be really awkward, and that's going to be funny. Like, I thought that was a good episode of television. I enjoyed it, but, like, give me an all-black show. Give me, a better version of Margaret Cho's All-American Girl.
Listen, I think that we do agree, actually, on the kind of overarching issue, and back to something I said earlier, of that, I don't think that these are, black and white issues. I mean, if you had told me, and you said, I'm reporting tomorrow that all of the major networks are rolling out their shows next year, and there's not a single one that has a black character in it, to say that I wouldn't be alarmed by that and think that that was ridiculous, and also, by the way, stupid business, I would be sort of horrified by it. What my objection, just want to sort of sharpen this point, that my objection is not to saying that I don't think that, it makes a difference if, sort of African Americans growing up, on my block or something, turn on the television, they never see a representation of themselves. Yeah, I mean, that is, I can imagine, probably the sort of understatement of being soul-crushing and offensive. My objection is, of course, to sort of shoehorning that into everything. And that was, again, why I put sort of the girls thing as the biggest component, because it was the sort of biggest argument about sort of race in television last year, one that I paid closest attention to. So just to be clear, I don't think that this is something that should be ignored, and that, screw everybody.
I just think, I think there is a real danger of sounding snide and suggesting that people are being oversensitive because the solution they're proposing to a problem is one that you find sort of picky or PC, right? I mean, do you think people are being oversensitive in some instances? I mean, for instance, that Archer piece, which is hilarious misunderstanding of the show. Look, I think people read pop culture in ways that is wrong sometimes. I mean, to talk about Zero Dark 30 for a minute. I am I'm so baffled by the idea that is a pro-torture movie in any way. It's just, I literally had to stop talking to people about Zero Dark 30 because I find the sort of unwillingness of people to assess it as art and to understand what assessing it as art. And I don't think assessing it as art means that it gets a free pass. I think what assessing it as art means is that you're looking for different clues to determine intent and argument. And I mean, like Jane Mayer sort of dismissing it as morally neutral entertainment. It's just like, it's one of the most confounding things I've ever read. I read that piece and it's just, I mean, I literally have my head in my hands right now because I was so confused. And I think that when people encounter ideas that they're uncomfortable with in art, I mean, let me put it this way. Pop culture doesn't often ask audiences to do a lot of work. And I think Zero Dark 30 is a movie that asked audiences to do an enormous amount of work, right? It's a movie that, you know, where its main character's eyes are at any given moment and like what she's willing to look at or not look at is the way that you understand the movie, but it's not as if Maya ever says, I can't bear to look at what you're doing to Amar, right?
No, I thought what I was totally fascinated by was that I came away from watching that movie thinking that there was something wrong with me because I have so many friends and people that I really, really respect who objected to the film portraying torture as leading to the scummy little compound in Abbottabad. And so when I walked away, I didn't get that impression at all. And I said, God, do I have to watch this again? Did I misread this? And what I think, Catherine Bigelow being so unbelievably talented as a director, and what I was so impressed by was the fact that so many people I respect came away with such different views. I mean, I have, Andrew Sullivan, who's a friend and, somebody who does not take his stuff lightly at all, and Michael Moore agreeing and saying, hey, this is not a pro-torture movie. And I thought, my objection and why I actually, in hindsight, shouldn't have led with something about Zero Dark 30, because that is something where I did try to, in a transition, say, hey, no, should be politicized. But I did like the Mark Bowl quote. I was saying, it's a movie. Don't take this to be the kind of, final verdict, like a sort of congressional report on what torture did and did not do. I was sympathetic to that because, I can imagine pulling your hair out and saying that's not what I'm trying to say. Must be very frustrating. But I think that's actually skillful filmmaking when you've provoked a debate like this that has actually been, in some senses, rather smart and impressive. Whereas I think that saying a VW ad is racist because somebody has a Jamaican accent or Archer is, homophobic, I don't think those are smart arguments. I think those are sort of page view generating, outrageous. I just don't find them useful. So, in one sense, I think that maybe it was a mistake for me to actually mention Zero Dark 30 at all, because, it is something that should be seriously debated.
One thing I would say, though, Michael, is as a critic, often when someone looks at something and says, that is racist or that is homophobic, I actually often use that as a sort of sign that I should be looking at whether a joke or a scene worked. Right? Because people don't intend, this is mass entertainment, right? And so, again, to me, this stuff is always about efficacy and specificity. And, I don't think that Volkswagen, hates people of color. I do think that, resorting to a Jamaican accent is Jamaica's a country. Patois a language. It's, the fact that it exists is not actually insightful or funny, right? I mean,
by the way, just a quick quote, when I saw that and I saw the complaints about it, and I tweeted something stupid about it, and actually got a tweet back from a Jamaican guy who said, "Oh no, I thought it was funny, and my family thought it was funny, or whatever." And it doesn't mean anything if one Jamaican guy thinks that, but it reminded me of the kind of idea of my people in my family who are older and don't understand that what they can and cannot say. I mean, they're not racist, but they'll say they'll whisper oh, he's Mexican. I'm like, no, but that's a country. It's fine. That's not offensive. But they're being sort of overly okay, there's race being invoked. It's not really race, it's a country. I mean, there are white people in Jamaica that speak with that accent. But so people get very tense and they say, oh goodness, is there something that we should be on the lookout for here? Which I understand that instinct, but I think we too often just think that instinct means something bad has happened. It's
sure,
not,
and
it's,
I think this is where the folks in Deception got themselves in trouble, right? And this is actually something that I hear from white writers in Hollywood fairly frequently, is that they're afraid of specificity because they don't want to get something wrong.
Yeah,
and
I can understand that. Yeah.
Or, they're afraid to talk about something because they don't want to screw up. And the answer to that, of course, is, hire people of color for your writer's room, and then you'll have someone in the room who can give you at least an initial gut check on whether something is wrong or racist or actually funny or insightful, instead of just being like, oh, Kwanzaa, I mean, someone who thinks that, Kwanzaa is hilarious, for example. It's just
does intention matter? Because, I think of this guy at ESPN who was fired for that Jeremy Lin headline, and it was widely acknowledged by, I think, everybody and people at ESPN too, ESPN also, because I think ESPN2 is a channel, that it was unintentional, and he was fired and, branded a racist, and I think a lot of people walked that back afterwards. But, I think there's stuff that's intentionally hurtful and designed to make people look stupid or violent or whatever, ugly stereotype that is being employed. And sometimes people just being clumsy, I just wonder if we should treat them with the same kind of word. It's all racist.
And I think part of this is that when we talk about race in particular, and we've ended up sort of focusing this conversation on race, which is good, I think is important. I think that we have a lot of trouble with the idea that, falling into racial insensitivity is a judgment on a whole person, right? I'm a white woman who grew up in America. I have white privilege, and, I have been inculcated, because I am a white woman growing up in America, with ideas that are not what I wish they were, right? In my life, I have been racially insensitive. I have, not been everything I would wish to be. And I wish we could talk about, people doing things that are racially insensitive, that are racist, that come out of sort of misunderstanding without, and, I say this in part because it's a charity that I benefited from, right? That I've had people who have been willing to sort of educate and correct me and challenge my assumptions, and I've gotten a lot out of that. I am a beneficiary of that kind of conversation, and I am extremely grateful for it. And, I think, everybody has non-neutral racial attitudes, right? I think everybody does. I don't think there is... I find this sort of idea
what is the Avenue Q, everybody's a little bit racist?
Right?
Song at Avenue Q,
Yeah. Right. I think, I think that, and there are people who are actively, virulently racist. There's a difference between someone who is a Klan member and someone who, grows up with stereotypes as shorthand, with, limited information, with just plain unfamiliarity with things, and is sort of trying to understand that, and, this is something that operates in multiple directions. And I think those conversations are very hard to have, and again,
Can I say that I think that it actually, I can tie this back into what I wrote and what the point of it was in a lot of ways. And it is in that last paragraph, the second to last paragraph or something, is that I think the problem with this stuff, and I don't pick on this to say, oh, look at how PC and annoying these people are. That's not the intention. As a matter of fact, and this is, I've been talking to my agent about this and talking about writing a book that is a sort of cultural history of political correctness that actually would look at it in a non-polemical way and say that, in a lot of senses, there's been a lot of good done. It's fantastic that people don't feel comfortable making racist comments even among friends anymore. That's been a positive byproduct of quote unquote PC. What I think the purpose of me writing this was is that I think that it inures people to real problems and racism. And, you know, the burden of proof, as I wrote, is surprisingly low for a charge that is unbelievably toxic and really hurt people's careers and hurt their lives. And as we saw with as I mentioned, the kid from ESPN, among many other examples. But, you know, what I think happens, which I think is the huge problem here, is what has happened in some senses with hate crimes. There have been, you know, more hate crimes, actual hate crimes, than there have been fake hate crimes by a factor of God knows how many. But every time you have one of those fake ones, and there were a good number of them this year, I wrote a piece about this earlier, they have this really pernicious effect of sort of building up people's tolerance in a way and saying that, well, you know, it's probably phony. I mean, I see these people every time something, you know, every time Joan Rivers or Lisa Lampanelli or Jim Norton or Don Rickles is on, they say it's racist. And, you know, people start thinking, and I have seen this, that nothing is racist anymore because there's so many sort of nonsense charges. And I think that is my ultimate problem, is that you make, I think, a very strong point, is that, you know, what you grow up with and what I grew up with, and we all have these problems that need to be, and people have pointed them out to us. And I'm thankful that some of the stupid shit that I probably believed a lot when I was a lot younger, I no longer do. That said, I wish that we would stop debasing a very real and a very serious thing with such silliness. And there's a lot of silliness. And again, I'm not saying that this is what you wrote. I mean, what my criticism of you, as I said, was just that, you know, maybe they didn't want to write a show about this. I mean, in a sense,
sure.
That's what I was saying.
I guess my challenge to you is that, you know, as someone whose, you know, physical image gets reflected, as someone whose life experience is reflected a great deal in entertainment, as someone where people like you are very in control of this apparatus, I think it's very difficult. I really
wish I was in control of this apparatus in some sense.
Sure,
I know what you're saying. I'm just joking. So.
I think it's really, really difficult for you to put yourself in a position to tell other people.
But that's what a lot of these people are doing. A lot of people who are making these criticisms are white people like me. You know, I mean, they're putting their self in, theirs is valid and mine isn't.
Sure, but you know, I know as a woman that I, you know, watch and absorb a lot of stuff, and occasionally it just feels like too much. A lot of the time it feels like too much. And a lot of this anger comes from the fact that the system is so skewed, that these representations are so deeply skewed, that the offerings in some cases are so bad or so limited. And, you know, I don't think it's wrong to respond to that with a sense of real anger. I disagree.
Oh, no, I think that's right. I think you're right.
Let me finish.
I'm not cutting you off. I'm just saying I think you're right.
I disagree profoundly with Lena Dunham's critics about the mechanisms by which their, I think, real and legitimate pain at lack of certain kinds of representation should be addressed. But, you know, I rather than suggesting that people are sort of wrong to see racism or sexism or homophobia, I would rather rechannel those frustrations into more sort of productive and specific calls for change, right? Like, I'm never going to tell Charles Blow that he's wrong to feel like a Volkswagen ad that's, I think, is kind of lazy, is racist. You know, if I had to put up, if I was an African-American man and had to put up with the representations of people like me in popular culture, I would not be functional as a critic. I'm barely functional as a woman writing about what I see in entertainment. And so to me, when people get sensitive or upset about something, that's a call for me to go back and look at it. And I may not decide that I agree with them or that I have the same reaction, but I think that looking at these kinds of arguments as a chance to talk about sort of writing quality and, you know, and acting quality and shot quality and everything else, as well as about sort of the structure of the industry, is productive. And I think it's very, very dangerous to put ourselves in the position of saying that someone is wrong to feel this way or react this way.
I think we agree on one thing, though, as you said, that, my point is the sort of rechanneling of these things in a lot of ways. And I don't think that if somebody has experience with racism and sort of horrible racism that has sort of plagued this country since its existence, since inception, that, I still think that they can make criticisms that are wrong or unhelpful or, sort of directed at the wrong culprit.
I'm curious about who gets to decide what's helpful and what's unhelpful.
I do, because I'm a writer, and you do because you're a writer. I think that, there's some ideas that, whether it's Eric Bowling or saying that the Muppets are anti-capitalist or something, that I think that's silly. And I do think that if somebody is, white or African-American or Jewish or Irish Catholic, saying that Lena Dunham has a race problem, and that was a headline that I saw, I think that's silly too. And I don't think that I should, and I think that would make both of our lives very difficult if we had to check out of criticism because the person making the statement that we're criticizing has had a different and even sort of far more difficult experience in America than we have. I think that would make criticism a much poorer and sort of slightly more boring place.
And I would say that my experience as a critic has been a lot richer for listening in those conversations. I think that
your experience hasn't been what? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
That my experience as a critic has been much richer for listening and sitting with those conversations, even ones where, I didn't have a similar reaction or where I think the solution should be different. Because, what's interesting about art is how people react to it, right? And, I think that what's exciting about really good art is that people can read it a lot of different ways. What's exciting about good art is that it teaches people how to read it, which is why I think Justified is one of those interesting issues. But I think that, if someone reacts to popular culture and either feels like it's racist or it's sexist or it's homophobic, something is happening in the writing there. There's something that we can learn about structure and execution. And rather than say that reaction is or isn't helpful, I kind of want to do that archaeology. That is interesting to me.
But what if you find out when you do the archaeology that you disagree with them?
Then it's an interpretation that I disagree with. It's not.
Yeah. So that's basically what I waited a long time to write anything about the girls thing after the girls show after I had watched all of them and then read everybody's pieces on them. And I actually thought that, I'm going to go into this and with as open a mind as possible. And, hey, there's been a hell of a lot of racist television in the past, and it wouldn't have surprised me if something like that existed. I just didn't think it did in this case.
Sure. And that's, I think that I'm trying to find a good way to put this. Your eyes aren't everybody's eyes. And I'm interested in my own reactions to things, but I'm interested, I think that the reactions to girls come from reactions to a lot of really sort of legitimate complaints. I think that, and I think that I'm okay with the debate getting heated and extreme sometimes if it actually makes us take a look at what's there, because we can be pretty passive consumers, and that's a scary thing.
And I know we're sort of running out of time here. I'll just ask you one more question. I'm interested in your response. Because I'm sorry that we've talked about girls so much, but it's the show that I've watched the most and actually enjoyed the most. What did you think of the response in the sense that Lena Dunham created a black character, which I don't know. I mean, I don't know if she's killed off that character after 2 episodes. They seem to have broken up. Who knows? I don't know.
Comes back.
Well, I actually almost held. I think I filed my piece on Sunday, and I was like, well, I think I want to hold it to see if the character comes back this episode. What did you think of that? Of the way she dealt with it, and the way she responded to it? I mean, she actually said that I think that that's a good criticism. Whether or not you believe that.
People have only talked about Sandy, but she actually did sort of 2 things to respond to a criticism of the show on race, right? Like, the party episode in the premiere this season is much more racially diverse than any sort of group scene that we saw last year. And, some of the complaints that people had were about sort of the canvas of the show, and she just changed that and changed it without comment. And, sort of gracefully, all the casting looked good. And then I really liked Sandy as a character, in part because he wasn't just an African-American character who was there, right? He was a character who was there to give voice to all of the sort of criticisms of the show and kind of to be proven right? Like,
and to challenge her assumptions on a lot of levels, and political assumptions too.
Right. I mean, Sandy says that Hannah's essay, it just wasn't for him. And he's probably right. He can still like her and respect her and understand that she is writing sort of for a different audience than him. And she's defensive. She wants everyone to love her. And, she says, no, it's for everybody. And it's not for everybody, right? Like, Sandy is absolutely correct. Girls is not for everybody. It was never trying to be. It was never intended to be. And I think that's smart. I think that there are going to be a lot of people, and the show is really committed to, like, Hannah's unlikability this season, which I think is a ballsy move.
Which is interesting. It's an interesting development,
Yeah. But I think for the show to say, you are correct, but to defend that it's okay to narrowcast is, I think, exactly the response Dunham should have had. I thought that was really smart.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it. I liked the sort of political twist, and as a matter of fact, defended Lena Dunham on television when Republicans were being assholes and saying that she called Republicans Nazis in this New York Magazine interview, which was a unbelievable misreading of what she said. And she was saying that, my character has these assumptions that she knows nothing about them. She thinks they're all fascists, and she's disabused of that in a way. And then, of course, the political reaction from the right, and you mentioned the Breitbart website, the big Hollywood thing. And I came across one of these things the other day of, like, how conservatives have to stop complaining and make their own girls. And it's like, it's even worse in the other direction, I think. And I don't want to be considered, by the way, a sort of unidirectional political attack, because, I mean, the right in their response to girls and Lena Dunham, because she's wearing a Planned Parenthood T-shirt, she did the Obama ad. I mean, she's in their crosshairs for other reasons. So.
Right. But look, at the end of the day on this, I think we can agree that it's one thing to read this stuff with, like, a checkbox. The Muppets are promoting socialism. And it's another to want this stuff because it's textured, because it's detailed. I think that, art is political and politics can be a sign of quality issues. And I think that, if that can be the place where the debate is taking place, where representation is important, not just because, equal employment is a goal that we care about, but because the stories will be more varied and more interesting. And, oh my God, we don't need another fucking crime procedural.
No, I find that very, very compelling. Right. I mean, I think it's a compelling argument that certain shows can be enriched by certain characters. My only, of course, objection, I think that's probably the one that we might not disagree on, is trying to, make every show or a show where it might not fit. I mean, or, Lena Dunham my objection is I actually feel bad for Lena Dunham, the fact that she has to read all these articles about how she's a racist when I've met real racists, and those are the people that should be called racist, not somebody like Lena Dunham who I suspect isn't. But, it's the shoehorning it in, the all art must serve the people kind of idea. And again, this is not something I accuse you of. I think that there's micro examples of it all over the place.
But I think at the end of the day, like, everyday life is political, and I think it's...
Sure. Yeah.
I think that a lot of it is sort of, a lot of it depends on how you define, like, what's political, right? I mean, I think that The Americans is a show that's political on two levels, right? Its main characters are KGB agents. They have an anti-capitalist ideology, you know, and so that's a part of the story. But
was that show good, by the way?
The Americans is awesome. Go watch The Americans.
I missed it last night and was so annoyed. I went to Hulu
Go.
Yeah, but they only had clips.
Right. We will end this on the note that you should go watch The Americans.
I'm really excited to watch it. If I could do anything, I would stop writing about politics for the rest of my life and only write about the Cold War, which is what I do sometimes, book reviews and such. And I've heard this is a very good show, so I'm excited to watch it. So
go watch Win, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Alyssa.